In today's episode, we'll break down two important stories. First, we'll talk about whether Iran exacts an oil toll on the world, and then we'll talk about India's 4,000 crore rupee bet on digging mud from the sea. Welcome back to the Daily Brief by Zerodha, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what's actually happening in the most important stories from business and markets. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Friday, 27th March. Coming to the first story. 20% of the world's oil passes through a 21-mile wide strip of water between Iran and Oman. For decades, that passage was free, guaranteed by international law enforced by the US Navy. But over the last week, reports from Bloomberg, Lloyd's List, and the Financial Times suggest that may no longer be the case. Iran, they say, has started charging ships up to $2 million each to pass through. Iranian lawmakers claim it's already happening, and a bill to formalize the toll is reportedly moving through parliament. However, this claim doesn't escape debate, and some of the counters ironically come from parts of Iran's own state machinery. For instance, Iran's embassy in India says the reports are unfounded. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign ministry refuses to comment. So, is Iran running a toll booth on the most important choke point in global energy? We don't know, and that's part of the story. We'll be saying some version of the words, if this is true, a lot of times in this story. That's how blurry the line between fact and fiction and the line between legal and informal is. But ultimately, such scenarios and counterfactuals exist because their underlying context is real, and that's what we'll be exploring. Now, if the reports are to be believed, the Strait of Hormuz toll exists simultaneously in two forms. The first form is an informal operational system that's already exacting payments from ships. In parallel, there may be a formal parliamentary bill in the works to legally enshrine the system. The ambiguity lies in the gap between the two. In the informal system, reportedly, ships are being routed through a narrow corridor between Iran's Qishma and Larak Islands, passing through Iranian territorial waters under the supervision of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The IRGC verifies vessel details and, according to Lloyd's List, extracts a passage fee. At least two vessels reportedly paid around $2 million each. Now over to the formal side. There's a strong push to pass this bill that will formalize the toll system. One member of the parliament told Iranian media in mid-March that countries should pay tolls and taxes to the Islamic Republic if the Strait of Hormuz is used as a secure route. Another went on state TV claiming the $2 million fee was already in effect, framing it as a demonstration of Iran's strength. Iran's parliament speaker stated flatly that the strait's pre-war status quo would not return. Now, Iran's diplomats officially deny all of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't happening. If anything, the denial might be the message. Publicly acknowledging a toll on an international strait would invite legal challenges, give the US a clearer justification for military escalation, and alarm countries like India that Iran still needs as customers. In that view, as Iran, you rather deny it while quietly collecting the money. And this ambiguity may not be so much of a bug as it could be a feature or the leverage Iran holds. Even the parliamentary bill fits this reading. It isn't creating a toll from scratch, and instead it's positioning Iran to formalize something that may already be happening on the water at a time of its choosing. The lawmakers making bold claims on state TV, meanwhile, could be perceived as providing nationalistic morale to a domestic audience that's worried about its nation's defenses. The international reaction has been fractured, to say the least. President Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum on March 22nd demanding Iran fully reopen the strait, then postpone strikes for 5 days, citing productive conversations with Tehran. The US military has destroyed over 130 Iranian naval vessels and still can't guarantee safe passage. US Navy officials told the shipping industry that military escorts are not an immediate option. On the other side, a 22-nation coalition, including the UK, France, Germany, and Japan, condemned Iran's actions, but largely to appease Trump, while most European nations explicitly refused military participation. Saudi Arabia went furthest, expelling Iranian embassy staff, opening air bases for US operations, diverting oil exports to its Red Sea port, and explicitly reserving the right to take military action. India's shipping ministry, for its part, called the reports baseless under international law. Now, all of this is happening fast. It seems that Iran's strategy has evolved in distinct phases since the war began. First came outright closure with mines, missile threats, and halting all freight. Then came selective passage for states Iran deemed non hostile. And now, if the reports are accurate, they're charging for the privilege of transit. Iran can't win a conventional war against the US, but it can sit on a choke point and charge rent. Legally, Iran should not be allowed to do this. UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is pretty clear on this. All ships enjoy the right of transit passage through international straits, and that passage shall not be impeded, and no charge may be levied on foreign ships by reason of their passage alone. Iran has signed but never ratified UNCLOS, which gives it a narrow technical argument. But most international law scholars regard transit passage as customary international law, binding on all states regardless. The International Court of Justice established that principle as far back as 1949, well before UNCLOS existed. Now, Iranian lawmakers have cited the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and Turkey's Bosphorus as precedents for the kind of toll they're looking to set up. But each of these actually undermines their argument. Suez and Panama, for instance, are man made waterways. The fees compensate for the cost of building and maintaining the infrastructure. Turkey's Bosphorus charges modest service fees under a specific 1936 treaty that predates and is grandfathered into modern maritime law. The Strait of Hormuz, in contrast, is a natural waterway with no infrastructure to maintain and no treaty authorizing fees. But how much does international law matter during war? Who even has the power to enforce a country to adhere to the consequences of not following it? International maritime law assumes a functioning order where states respect norms because the costs of violating them, diplomatic isolation, trade retaliation, outweighs the benefits. But when you're already facing sanctions against the world's most powerful military, what's your incentive to follow it? Iran doesn't see how it can gain anything by adhering to the laws or lose anything by breaking them. It isn't weighing the legal risks of a toll against a stable status quo, but against American and Israeli airstrikes. But more than the geopolitics, what makes the story interesting is that the toll might actually be cheaper than the chaos it replaces. Before the current crisis, war risk insurance for a ship transiting the Strait of Hormuz cost roughly 0.02 to 0.05% of hull value, roughly $40,000 to $100,000 for a large oil tanker. By mid-March, those premiums had surged to around 5% of hull value. So for a very large crude carrier or VLCC, the workhorse ships that run global oil trade, that's roughly $5 million per transit just in insurance. Charter rates have also quadrupled. Now, the total additional cost per voyage, including insurance, charter premiums, routing changes, reached $4 to $6 million. In that context, $2 million for guaranteed safe passage starts to look like a perverse kind of bargain. You're paying for certainty in an environment where the alternative is no passage at all. The revenue potential at scale is enormous. Pre-crisis traffic through Hormuz was roughly 138 ships per day, carrying about 20 million barrels of oil, around 20% of global supply. An Iranian newspaper proposed that a 10% toll could generate $73 billion a year, a wildly theoretical number. It would incentivize investments by others to build bypass routes, but it reveals how big Iran's ambition is. The current bypass options, meanwhile, are limited. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline from its eastern oil fields to its Red Sea port of Yanbu, which can handle up to 7 million barrels per day. The UAE has a similar pipeline to Fujairah, carrying over 1.5 million barrels per day. Together, that's maybe 8 to 9 million barrels of bypass capacity. The gap, which is roughly 14 million barrels a day, have no alternative route. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain have no bypass infrastructure at all. This is also why the Gulf states have reacted with such aggressive hostility towards Iran. After all, their own oil exporters are taxed by a hostile neighbor that happens to sit at the mouth of their only maritime outlet. India is arguably the most exposed major economy in this entire situation. We import roughly 88 to 89% of its crude oil, 45% of which transited the Strait of Hormuz before the crisis. But it's not just crude. About 90% of India's LPG imports, over half its LNG, and roughly 40% of its fertilizer come through the strait. India's crude oil basket has surged from approximately $63 to $146 a barrel in a matter of weeks. Goldman Sachs has cut India's 2026 GDP growth forecast to 5.9%, and the rupee has fallen to record lows. PM Modi called the strait's closure unacceptable in parliament, but India's actual approach has been quietly bilateral rather than confrontational. India has not joined the US led coalition, nor has it condemned Iran by name. It's not engaged in discussions with the US about deploying naval vessels to force the strait open. Instead, Modi held two phone calls with Iran's President Pezeshkian, and the results have been tangible. In mid March, two Indian flagged LPG carriers owned by the Shipping Corporation of India were granted safe passage through the strait after loading from Qatar. Bloomberg reported that the Iranian Navy actively guided one of them through, staying in radio contact, verifying the ship's flag, crew nationality, and destination before escorting it along a pre approved route through Iranian waters. On March 23rd, two more LPG carriers followed the same route and are expected to reach Indian ports between March 26th and 28th. As a goodwill gesture, India also gave refuge to the crews of Iranian warships that were stranded in the Indian Ocean when the war broke out. Crucially, none of this involves any reference to a transit fee. India's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar told that there is no blanket arrangement for Indian ships. Every ship movement is an individual happening. 22 Indian flagged vessels remain stuck in the Gulf, and India is navigating this one tanker at a time through direct bilateral engagement with Tehran. Now, Iran needs India to keep buying its oil, and India needs Iran to keep the strait passable. For now, this mutual dependence is holding. The toll itself, whether it's real, aspirational, or somewhere in between, is best understood as a bargaining chip. Iran's stated demands for a ceasefire include lifting all economic sanctions, obtaining international legal guarantees, and establishing a new legal regime for the strait. The toll gives Iran something concrete to trade away. India's only worry is whether the strait stays open tomorrow. We listened to a lot of con calls while researching our stories, so we started a newsletter called The Chatter. It's a curated collection of the sharpest management quotes for that week in a neat and readable format published every Friday. The link is in the description. Coming to the second story. A few days ago, the Dredging Corporation of India announced it wants to more than double its revenue to Rs 3,000 crore over the next 5 years. The Prime Minister has committed Rs 4,000 crore to modernize its fleet. The company is buying 11 new dredgers. Now, all of this money is dedicated to just doing one thing: clear sand, silt, and rock from the bottom of harbors, rivers, and shipping channels so that large ships can pass through. That simply is dredging. India's own dredging guidelines estimate the country will need roughly 3 billion cubic meters of dredging over the next decade. Sediment builds up naturally, and every major port in India depends on regular dredging to stay open. Now, to see where that demand comes from, let's start with what happens at India's biggest ports. So, between 2017 and 2019, India's major ports moved roughly 159 million cubic meters of sediment. And the Kolkata port, now called Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Port, is the most dramatic example of how intense dredging an Indian port is. The government's 2021 dredging guidelines show the port as having among the highest siltation and dredging volumes of any Indian port. And the reason for that lies in the Hooghly estuary near the port, which connects the Hooghly River to the Bay of Bengal. The river carries enormous quantities of silt from the Ganga system, depositing it across the shipping channel without pause. The port spends Rs 300 to 500 crore annually just fighting this. Yet, it's still not always enough. The port has two docks, one at Kolkata and 100 kilometers away at Haldia. Ships heading to Haldia sometimes have to partially unload cargo at neighboring ports first because the river is too shallow for fully loaded vessels. Now, on the other end of the country lies the Cochin port, and it faces a different version of this fight. Now, at this port, every monsoon, the river mouth silts up heavily, making it one of the ports with the highest dredging demand in the country. At ports like these, dredging is not a one-time job. It's a permanent running cost like electricity or wages. If you stop dredging for a season, the channel becomes too shallow for commercial ships to pass through. India is also becoming more ambitious, and it needs nature to support those ambitions. We want bigger ships to dock at its ports, and bigger ships need deeper channels. Under the Sagarmala program, the government has identified 839 projects worth Rs 5.7 lakh crore aimed at port-led development. A significant chunk involves deepening channels and building new docking points, and all of it starts with moving sediment out of the way. But dredging isn't merely about moving soft mud. It's not one machine doing one thing. It's an entire chain. Surveying the seabed, cutting or sucking up the sediment, transporting it, dumping or reusing it, and then surveying again to confirm the required depth has been achieved. Every step adds to the cost bill. More importantly, the seabed doesn't always cooperate with the original digging plans, and that makes the whole exercise a particularly expensive affair. As per a feasibility study by the Mumbai Port Trust, dredging soft soil costs roughly rupees 110 per cubic meter, while dredging rock costs rupees 4,000 per cubic meter. That's a 36-fold gap between the earning potential and the actual costs. An unexpected rock layer beneath the seabed is one of the most feared discoveries in Indian port engineering. One mistake in the initial soil survey can blow a project's budget by orders of magnitude. The 2021 dredging guidelines explicitly warn that disputes frequently arise from inadequate soil information and wrong dredger selection. A contractor bids based on the port's soil survey, but if the survey itself has holes, then the costs inflate beyond what's on paper. And more often than not, this also leads to cases in court disputing the survey and deciding who should bear the new inflated costs. Perhaps what's more telling is the government's delayed payments to ports, who are the main customers of any dredging company. For instance, the government has reportedly not paid over rupees 1,000 crore in dredging subsidies to the Kolkata port that were approved over a decade ago. The ministry's position is that profitable ports should fund dredging on their own. But the port's counter is that if they do so, they'll pass the cost to exporters and importers through higher shipping charges. As a result, trade suffers. This is perhaps a common problem in infrastructure projects where the government has a heavy hand or is the biggest customer. Now, for the longest time, dredging has been a public monopoly led by the government-owned Dredging Corporation of India. Established in 1976, DCI dominates maintenance dredging at India's major ports. It's always been the anchor for the government's wishes to improve India's sea infrastructure. Now, being a public sector enterprise, DCI often runs on losses or really low profits. Its fleet has an average age of more than 20 years. Some vessels have crossed their useful life entirely. Old dredgers mean higher fuel consumption, lower productivity, frequent breakdowns, and disqualification from contracts that set age limits on equipment. In this context, DCI is undertaking a rupees 4,000 crore fleet overhaul and procuring 11 new dredgers. The first, with a 12,000 cubic meter capacity, is being built at Cochin shipyard and expected by June 2026. But even with these new vessels, DCI's total fleet will still be modest against the scale of work India is planning. Meanwhile, a much smaller private company is growing fast in the same space. Knowledge Marine and Engineering Works, or KMEW, founded in 2015, is the only other publicly listed dredging company. It operates a younger fleet focused on more river and inland dredging, and it's a fraction of DCI's size, but it has a heavier focus on profits. Its fleet runs at 100% utilization with dredgers operating 270 to 300 days a year. Its order book has swelled to rupees 1,500 crore, and it's leaner and moves much faster than DCI. Some of its high net margins may be due to base effects, but it certainly also benefits from higher efficiency. Now, the cost of India's port expansion is not only fiscal, it's also borne by the people who live along the coast. At Virinjam, or Kerala's southern coast, the construction of the international seaport has been linked to faster erosion along nearby fishing villages. The port's large stone barriers, which extend into the sea, disrupted the natural movement of sand along the coast, starving beaches to the north. Protests turned violent, with around 80 people injured. The port authorities have maintained that they followed all environmental clearances, but the fishers point to their disappearing shorelines and say the clearances were not enough. However, a few kilometers north of Virinjam at Muttalapori, the story is a complete mirror image of the situation at Virinjam. Fishers there have demanded regular dredging of the harbour mouth because dangerous siltation, which they blame on the port's impact on coastal patterns, has capsized boats. Their demand is not stop dredging, but dredge more and dredge here too. On one hand, the port is the problem and dredging is the solution, while on the other hand, the inverse is true. Every port expansion changes how sand moves along the coast. But the consultations meant to address this are rarely balanced. A port authority backed by national development goals sits across the table from fishing communities whose livelihoods depend on a coastline being reshaped by forces they can't control. Now, DCI's first new dredger arrives at Cochin shipyard by June 2026. 10 more are in the pipeline. KMEW is planning rupees 183 crore in fleet expansion over 3 years and has entered shipbuilding. The Kolkata subsidy dispute remains unresolved, and on the coast of Kerala, fishers and port authorities continue to argue over who should bear the cost of a changing shoreline. The mud will keep coming back as it always does, but what's less certain is whether India is building the institutions to deal with it appropriately. Now, coming to the tidbits. The Indian Medical Association wants the government to limit GLP-1 prescriptions to specialists like endocrinologists. It says these drugs are being misused for cosmetic weight loss and risks could rise further as cheaper generics enter the market. Coming to the next tidbit. Vari Energies has approved a Rs 3,900 crore investment to set up a solar glass plant and will increase its stake in Vari Transpower. The move strengthens its position in the fast-growing solar manufacturing space as competition increases. Coming to the final tidbit. United Spirits will sell the Royal Challengers Bengaluru franchise to an Aditya Birla-led group in a Rs 16,660 crore all-cash deal. The sale helps the company focus on its core alcohol business while transferring a major IPL franchise to new owners. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.